When I returned from my deployment, I found my son locked in the basement. My father laughed and said he'd just been teaching him respect. I called the police, but when the officer saw my father, he stepped back and asked, "Sir, is that really your dad?" I'd been standing in my childhood home for less than 5 minutes, fresh off a military transport from Afghanistan, when I'd heard the sound that made my blood freeze. A faint scratching from below the floor, rhythmic and desperate, coming from the basement door that had a padlock I'd never seen before. My father was sitting in his recliner watching television, beer in hand at 2 in the afternoon, and when I'd asked him what that sound was, he'd smiled this casual smile and said it was just Dylan being taught a lesson. My 7-year-old son, locked in the basement. During the 10-month deployment I'd just completed, I'd survived 2 IED attacks, a firefight that had killed 3 men in my unit, and the constant stress of operating in hostile territory. Nothing had prepared me for this moment. My hands had started shaking as I'd demanded the key. My father had told me to calm down, that the boy needed discipline, that he'd been raising him right while I'd been gone. I'd grabbed the key from the hook by the kitchen and had run to unlock the basement door. Dylan had been huddled at the bottom of the stairs, filthy, wearing the same clothes I'd seen him in via video chat 3 weeks ago. The basement was unfinished, concrete floor, exposed pipes, no heat despite it being November. He'd looked up at me with eyes that had barely registered recognition, too traumatized to immediately process that I was real and home. I'd carried him upstairs, felt how light he was, noticed the bruises on his arms that he'd tried to hide by pulling his sleeves down. My father had stood up from his recliner, told me I was overreacting, that boys needed to be toughened up, that my soft approach to parenting was exactly why Dylan had needed a firm hand. He'd said this while my son was shaking in my arms, while I was realizing that the grandfather I'd trusted to care for my child during my deployment had been abusing him systematically. I'd told my father to get out of my house. He'd laughed, reminded me it was his house, that I'd moved back in with him after my divorce specifically so Dylan would have family support during my deployment. The laughter had been the thing that had made me call the police. I'd been serving as a combat engineer with the Army for 12 years, deployed 4 times to various theaters, always with the understanding that my service was protecting my family and my country. My ex-wife Lisa had left 3 years ago, taken our daughter Megan in the divorce, left Dylan with me because her new husband hadn't wanted to raise another man's son. The custody arrangement had been painful, but clear. I'd had primary custody of Dylan, Lisa had gotten Megan, and we'd both tried to make it work, despite the awkwardness and hurt. When my deployment orders had come through 10 months ago, I'd faced an impossible choice. Lisa had refused to take Dylan, said her new marriage was too fragile to add another child. My only family was my father, retired Command Sergeant Major Raymond Holt, decorated veteran of 3 wars, pillar of the small military town where he'd lived for 40 years. Everyone respected him. The local VFW had his photo on the wall. The mayor had given him a community service award 2 years ago. He'd seemed like the obvious choice to care for Dylan while I was deployed. The video chats during my deployment had been brief and regulated, satellite connection allowing only 20 minutes every 2 weeks. Dylan had always seemed quiet, subdued, but I'd attributed that to missing me and adjusting to living with his grandfather. My father had been present during most of the calls, ensuring Dylan knew what to say, how to act. He'd told me Dylan was doing fine in school, making friends, learning discipline and respect. The few times I'd noticed Dylan looked tired or had a bruise, my father had explained it away. Boys play rough. He fell off his bike. He's clumsy like all kids. I'd believed him because he was my father, because he'd raised me with strictness, but not cruelty, because his military record and community standing suggested he was trustworthy and capable. I'd been wrong about all of it. Officer Jeremy Paulson had arrived within 15 minutes of my call. Young guy, maybe 26. Nervous energy suggesting he was relatively new to the force. I'd explained the situation while holding Dylan, showed him the basement with the padlock, pointed out the bruises on my son's arms. Officer Paulson had taken notes, asked questions about how long Dylan had been locked down there, whether this had happened before. I'd said I didn't know. I'd just returned from Afghanistan, but my father had admitted to it like it was normal discipline. That's when Officer Paulson had asked to speak with my father. Raymond had stood up with this posture I'd recognized from my childhood, the command presence that made people instinctively defer to authority. He'd been wearing his VFW cap, had his military decorations displayed on the wall behind him, looked every bit the respected veteran. When Officer Paulson had seen him clearly, his demeanor had changed. He'd stepped back slightly, his voice shifting from professional authority to something more uncertain, and he'd asked me directly, "Sir, is that really your dad? Command Sergeant Major Holt?" I'd confirmed yes, that was my father. And why did that matter when my son had been locked in a basement? Officer Paulson had looked between me and my father, clearly conflicted, then had said he'd needed to call his supervisor. My father had used that moment to launch into his explanation. He'd told Officer Paulson that Dylan had been misbehaving, talking back, refusing to follow rules. The basement timeout had been discipline, old school but effective, nothing more than what boys used to experience before everyone got soft. He'd mentioned his military service, his years raising me as a single father after my mother had died, his reputation in the community. Officer Paulson had listened with visible discomfort, taking notes but not taking action. He'd asked Dylan if he was okay now. My son had barely nodded, too scared to speak. Officer Paulson had said someone from Child Protective Services might follow up, but that this seemed like a family discipline matter, and he'd suggested we work it out internally. Then he'd left. I'd stood in the living room holding my son, watching the patrol car drive away, and had realized that my father's status in the community was going to protect him from consequences. The decorated veteran, the respected elder, the man who'd served his country and raised his son to do the same. Nobody wanted to believe that Command Sergeant Major Raymond Holt was capable of child abuse. It was easier to believe I was overreacting, that military discipline had been misunderstood by a generation too soft to handle real toughness. My father had sat back down in his recliner, told me I'd made a mistake calling the police, that I'd embarrassed him in his own home, and that if I didn't like how he'd handled things, I was welcome to leave. I'd carried Dylan upstairs to what had been my old bedroom, run a bath to clean him up, and started documenting every bruise and mark with my phone camera, while my hands had shaken with rage I'd been barely containing. The bruises had been extensive, finger marks on his upper arms consistent with grabbing, linear marks on his back that had looked like they'd come from a belt, bruising on his shins and knees suggesting he'd been kneeling on hard surfaces for extended periods. Dylan had flinched when I'd touched certain areas, had started crying when I'd asked how often he'd been locked in the basement. He'd said he didn't know, lots of times, whenever he'd done something wrong or made noise when his grandfather was watching TV. He'd said sometimes it was for hours, sometimes overnight. He'd said there was a bucket down there for a bathroom, and his grandfather had given him water but not always food. He'd been 7 years old describing solitary confinement administered by the man who was supposed to be protecting him. I'd held him while he'd cried, promised him he'd never be locked in a basement again, and had started making phone calls. The first call had been to the base hospital, getting Dylan an emergency appointment for the next morning. The second call had been to my commanding officer, explaining I'd need emergency family leave extended beyond my standard post-deployment time. The third call had been to a family attorney, a woman named Judith Carpenter, who'd handled my divorce, and who I'd trusted to understand the urgency. Judith had 26 years of family law experience, had seen every kind of custody battle and abuse allegation. When I described finding Dylan locked in the basement and the police officer's reaction to my father's status, she'd gone quiet for a moment. Then she'd said we needed to move fast, that community respect could insulate abusers from consequences, and that we'd needed medical documentation, CPS involvement, and a custody protection order before my father realized I was building a case. She'd told me to take photos of everything, document every conversation, and get Dylan to the doctor immediately. She'd also said something that had made my stomach drop, that if the local police wouldn't act because of my father's reputation, we might need to go to state authorities or military police. The medical appointment had been at 0800 the next morning at the base hospital, Dr. Florence Keating examining Dylan with the gentle thoroughness of someone who'd clearly dealt with abuse cases before. Dr. Keating had been a civilian contractor, 38 years old, board-certified in pediatrics with additional training in child trauma. She'd documented every bruise, every mark, every sign of malnutrition and dehydration. Dylan had been 11 pounds underweight for his age and height. He'd had a urinary tract infection consistent with restricted bathroom access. He'd had healing contusions on his back in a pattern consistent with belt strikes. Dr. Keating had asked Dylan direct questions in language a 7-year-old could understand, about how he'd gotten hurt, about what happened when he'd lived with his grandfather. Dylan had answered in this small voice, describing punishments that had escalated from yelling to timeouts in the basement to physical discipline with a belt. Dr. Keating had maintained professional composure while documenting everything, but I'd seen her jaw tighten when Dylan had described being locked in the dark basement overnight. The medical report had been damning. Dr. Keating had written that the injuries and conditions were consistent with ongoing physical abuse and neglect, that the pattern suggested systematic punishment rather than isolated incidents, and that the child showed signs of trauma and fear when discussing his living situation. She'd filed a mandatory report with Child Protective Services as required by law, and had told me that a social worker would likely contact me within 24 hours. She'd also recommended immediate therapy for Dylan, provided referrals to trauma specialists on base, and had suggested I document everything for potential legal proceedings. The medical report had been the first piece of evidence I'd needed, concrete documentation that couldn't be dismissed as overreaction or misunderstanding. My father's reputation couldn't argue with medical findings and a pediatrician's professional assessment. The CPS caseworker had been a man named David Strand, 43 years old, 16 years with the agency, carrying the exhausted determination of someone who'd seen too many cases like this. He'd come to my father's house that afternoon, interviewed me and Dylan separately, asked to see the basement and the padlock. My father had been cooperative in that calculating way abusers often were when authorities got involved, explaining that he'd used old-fashioned discipline techniques he'd learned in the military, that he'd never intended harm, that children today were too coddled and needed structure. David had listened without expression, taking notes, photographing the basement. Then he'd asked my father about the belt marks on Dylan's back. My father had said sometimes physical discipline was necessary when talking didn't work. David had asked how often Dylan had been locked in the basement. My father had said often enough to teach him respect. The casual admissions, delivered like reasonable explanations, had been incriminating in their honesty. David Strand had filed an emergency protection order that evening, removing Dylan from my father's custody immediately and placing him in my sole care pending investigation. He'd told me that based on the medical evidence, Dylan's statements, and my father's own admissions, there was clear cause for abuse findings. However, he'd also warned me that my father's community standing would complicate prosecution, that local authorities might be reluctant to charge a decorated veteran, and that I should prepare for pushback. He'd recommended I establish separate living arrangements immediately, that continuing to stay in my father's house could be construed as condoning the abuse or failing to protect Dylan. I'd packed our things that night, taken Dylan to a motel off base, and started looking for an apartment we could afford on my military salary. My father had watched us leave with this expression of betrayed anger, told me I was destroying my family over nothing, that I'd regret turning against him. Judith Carpenter had filed for emergency custody modification the next day, documenting everything: the medical report, the CPS findings, Dylan's statements, photographs of the basement, and the injuries. She'd requested sole custody with supervised visitation only, zero contact between Dylan and my father, and a restraining order preventing my father from approaching Dylan or interfering with his care. The hearing had been scheduled for 1 week later, family court judge presiding, meant to be a preliminary review before more extensive proceedings. Judith had warned me that family court could be unpredictable, that judges sometimes favored family reconciliation over protection, and that we'd needed to make the case airtight before anyone suggested sending Dylan back to his grandfather for reunification therapy or some other misguided intervention. The week before the hearing, I'd started noticing things that had made me understand how deep my father's community protection ran. The VFW had called me, an older veteran named Frank Kilgore, asking if there'd been a misunderstanding with my father, saying that Raymond Holt was a respected member who'd served honorably, and it seemed unlikely he'd hurt a child. The local newspaper had run a brief item about a decorated veteran facing family court proceedings, carefully worded to avoid libel but clearly sympathetic to my father. Several people I'd known growing up had called or messaged, suggesting I was being ungrateful, that my father had taken care of Dylan while I'd been deployed, and this was how I'd repaid him. The narrative was being shaped. I was the ungrateful son making false allegations against a war hero, probably suffering from deployment stress or PTSD, unable to handle normal discipline. My father's decades of community building were insulating him from consequences while painting me as the problem. I documented all of it: the phone calls, the messages, the newspaper article. Judith had said it could be useful for showing a pattern of community pressure and bias, that it demonstrated why local authorities might be reluctant to prosecute. She'd also suggested we get Dylan evaluated by a child psychologist who specialized in trauma and abuse, someone whose testimony would carry weight in family court. The psychologist had been Dr. Nina Solomon, 51 years old, 24 years of clinical practice, frequently called as an expert witness in custody cases. She'd evaluated Dylan over 3 sessions, using age-appropriate trauma assessments and play therapy to understand his experiences. Her written evaluation had been comprehensive and devastating. Dylan showed clear signs of complex trauma, including hypervigilance, fear responses to male authority figures, anxiety around basements and confined spaces, and dissociative symptoms consistent with severe ongoing stress. Dr. Solomon's professional opinion had been that Dylan had been subjected to psychological and physical abuse over an extended period, that his grandfather's behavior constituted child abuse by any clinical or legal definition, and that continued contact would cause lasting harm. The custody hearing had been scheduled for a Thursday morning, 9 days after I'd returned from deployment. I'd sat in family court with Judith, Dylan in a waiting room with a victim advocate, while my father had sat across the aisle with his attorney, a local lawyer named Gerald Fox, who'd represented him pro bono out of respect for his military service. Judge Alice Brennan had presided, 62 years old, 34 years on the bench, known for being tough but fair in custody matters. Judith had presented the evidence methodically: the medical report, the CPS findings, the psychological evaluation, photographs of Dylan's injuries and the basement setup, Dylan's recorded statements. She'd called Dr. Keating to testify about the medical findings. She'd called David Strand to testify about the CPS investigation. She'd called Dr. Solomon to testify about Dylan's trauma. Each witness had been professional, credible, unshakable in their conclusions that Dylan had been abused. Gerald Fox had tried to argue that this was generational discipline, that what looked like abuse to modern sensibilities had been normal child rearing for Raymond's generation, that no lasting harm had been intended or done. He'd presented character witnesses: the VFW commander talking about Raymond's service, a neighbor describing him as a dedicated grandfather, a pastor mentioning his church attendance. He'd suggested I was overreacting due to deployment stress, that military service often made people see threats where none existed. Judge Brennan had listened to all of it, her expression neutral, then had asked to see Dylan's photographs again. She'd studied them for several minutes, then had asked Gerald Fox directly whether he was arguing that locking a 7-year-old in an unfinished basement overnight constituted appropriate discipline. Gerald had hesitated, tried to reframe it, and Judge Brennan had cut him off. She'd ruled from the bench that the emergency custody modification was granted, that I had sole custody, that my father was prohibited from any contact with Dylan, and that CPS should refer the case to law enforcement for criminal investigation. The relief had been overwhelming. My father had stood up when the ruling was announced, started to say something about judicial overreach and disrespect for veterans. Judge Brennan had told him to sit down and be quiet, that his military service didn't exempt him from laws protecting children, and that if he violated the no-contact order, she'd hold him in contempt. The bailiff had escorted him from the courtroom. Gerald Fox had told me outside that I'd destroyed a good man's reputation over nothing, that the community wouldn't forget this betrayal. I'd told him that the medical evidence and my son's trauma weren't nothing, and that if the community cared more about a veteran's reputation than a child's safety, that said everything about their priorities. Then I'd collected Dylan, and we'd left. The criminal investigation had proceeded slowly. The local police had been reluctant to charge my father despite the court's referral, the same dynamic that had played out when Officer Paulson had responded to my initial call. The detective assigned to the case, a man named Lawrence Greer with 19 years on the force, had seemed sympathetic to my father's position. He'd interviewed me and Dylan, reviewed the evidence, then had told me that while the situation was concerning, it might be difficult to prove criminal intent versus poor judgment in disciplinary methods. He'd suggested that my father might benefit from parenting classes rather than prosecution, that destroying his life over what could have been a misunderstanding seemed harsh. I'd pointed out that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was documented abuse with medical evidence and expert testimony. Detective Greer had said he'd forward the case to the district attorney, but had warned me not to expect charges. Judith Carpenter had been frustrated, but not surprised. She'd said local prosecution often protected community figures, that law enforcement and legal officials had relationships and biases that influenced their decisions. She'd suggested we go to the state police or even federal authorities, since some of the abuse had occurred while I was on active deployment, and Dylan was effectively a military dependent. She'd also suggested contacting the base's JAG office, that military legal authorities might have jurisdiction given my active duty status and the failure of local authorities to protect my child. The path to accountability was becoming more complex, requiring multiple agencies and jurisdictions to overcome the local protection my father's reputation afforded him. The break had come from an unexpected source. Another parent at Dylan's school had contacted me, a woman named Patricia Wyatt, whose son had been in Dylan's class the previous year. She'd said she'd heard about the custody case and wanted to share something that had been bothering her. She'd noticed Dylan coming to school with bruises several times during the year, had reported it to the school counselor as required, but had been told that Dylan's grandfather was a respected veteran and the bruises were from normal childhood activities. Patricia had felt uncomfortable with that explanation but hadn't pushed further. Now, knowing what had happened, she'd wanted to provide a statement documenting her observations and the school's failure to investigate. She'd said there had been other parents who'd noticed similar things, but nobody had wanted to make waves about a decorated veteran's childcare methods. Patricia's statement had led to discovering the school records. As Dylan's parent, I'd had a right to his complete file, including counselor notes and incident reports. Judith had subpoenaed them through the family court. The records had shown 6 separate reports of suspected abuse over the 9 months Dylan had lived with my father. Teachers and staff had documented bruises, behavioral changes, Dylan's fear responses, his weight loss. Every report had been reviewed by the school counselor, a woman named Dorothy Falk, who'd consistently determined that the concerns were unfounded based on Dylan's grandfather's reputation and assurances. The pattern had been clear. The school had noticed the abuse, had documented it, but had failed to act because of who the abuser was. The failure had been systematic and deliberate, prioritizing a community figure's reputation over a child's safety. Judith had filed a civil suit against the school district for failure to protect, negligent supervision, and mandatory reporter violations. The lawsuit had gotten media attention beyond the local newspaper that had been sympathetic to my father. Regional news had picked up the story, interviewed Judith and Dr. Solomon about the medical findings and the systemic failure. The coverage had been professional but damning, laying out the evidence of abuse, the school's documented knowledge, and their failure to act. Public pressure had started building. Parents at the school had demanded answers about why reports had been ignored. The school board had announced an investigation. Dorothy Falk, the counselor who'd dismissed 6 abuse reports, had been placed on administrative leave. The media attention had changed the dynamics. The district attorney, a woman named Rebecca Cole, who'd been in office for 8 years, had announced she was personally reviewing the case. She'd met with Judith, reviewed the medical evidence, the CPS findings, the school records, and Dylan's statements. Then she'd called a press conference to announce that my father, Raymond Holt, was being charged with multiple counts of child abuse, child endangerment, and unlawful restraint. She'd stated clearly that no one's military service or community standing placed them above the law, that the evidence was overwhelming, and that her office would prosecute fully. The charges had been serious felonies, carrying potential prison time. My father's attorney, Gerald Fox, had tried to arrange a plea deal, but Rebecca Cole had been firm that the severity of the abuse and the systematic nature of the cover-up warranted a trial. The preliminary hearing had been scheduled for 6 weeks later, meant to determine if there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. The courtroom had been packed, media in the gallery, community members split between those supporting my father and those horrified by the evidence. My father had appeared in court wearing his military decorations, clearly trying to leverage his veteran status. The judge, a different judge than family court, had been a man named Honorable Thomas Keller, 58 years old, former military himself, known for being no-nonsense about both respecting service and enforcing law. Rebecca Cole had presented the evidence systematically. Dr. Keating's medical testimony, David Strand's CPS findings, Dr. Solomon's psychological evaluation, The photographs, the school records showing knowledge and inaction, Dylan's video-recorded statement describing the abuse. Gerald Fox had tried the same defense as in family court, arguing generational discipline and overzealous prosecution of a respected veteran. Judge Keller had listened to everything, then had called my father to the stand. He'd asked him directly, under oath, whether he'd locked Dylan in the basement. My father had said yes, for discipline. Judge Keller had asked how many times. My father had said multiple times, whenever the boy had needed correction. Judge Keller had asked whether he'd struck Dylan with a belt. My father had initially deflected, then admitted yes, sometimes corporal punishment had been necessary. Judge Keller had asked if he'd believed these actions were appropriate for a 7-year-old child. My father had said yes, that's how he'd been raised, and how he'd raised me, that it built character. The admissions, made under oath with the assumption that his service record would protect him, had eliminated any defense of misunderstanding or accident. He'd testified to deliberate, repeated abuse. Judge Keller had ruled that the evidence was more than sufficient for trial, had denied bail modification based on the severity of the charges and the defendant's access to the victim through family connections. My father had been remanded to county jail pending trial. The ruling had shocked him visibly, the reality that his status wasn't protecting him finally penetrating. Gerald Fox had tried to argue for release pending trial based on Raymond's military service and community ties. Judge Keller had said those same community ties were exactly why he posed a flight risk and a danger to witnesses, that the school records showed a network of people willing to cover for him, and that pretrial detention was appropriate. My father had been led out in handcuffs, still wearing his VFW cap, still not understanding that his service record didn't exempt him from consequences. The trial had been set for 3 months later, but it had never made it that far. Gerald Fox had met with Rebecca Cole, acknowledged that the evidence was overwhelming and that trial would only result in harsher sentencing. He'd negotiated a plea agreement. My father would plead guilty to 3 counts of child abuse and 1 count of unlawful restraint, receive a sentence of 8 years in state prison with credit for time served, and would be permanently prohibited from contact with Dylan or any minor children. He'd also be required to register as a child abuser, effectively ending any remaining reputation he'd had in the community. My father had taken the plea, faced with the alternative of likely conviction on all charges and a sentence potentially twice as long. The sentencing hearing had been brief. My father had stood before Judge Keller and had made a statement that had been part apology, part justification. He'd said he'd been trying to raise Dylan the only way he'd known how, that maybe he'd been too harsh, but that his intentions had been good. He'd mentioned his 3 wars, his 40 years of service, his belief that discipline and structure were what boys needed. Judge Keller had listened, then had delivered a sentencing statement I'd never forget. He'd said that military service, no matter how distinguished, didn't give anyone the right to abuse children. That discipline and abuse weren't the same thing, and systematically terrorizing a 7-year-old wasn't building character, it was destroying a child. That the defendant's failure to recognize the severity of his actions, even now, demonstrated exactly why the maximum sentence was appropriate. 8 years in state prison, permanent no-contact order, child abuser registry. The decorated veteran everyone had respected was going to prison as a child abuser. The aftermath had been complex. The school district had settled the civil suit for $200,000, money that went into a trust for Dylan's future therapy and education. Dorothy Falk, the counselor who'd ignored 6 abuse reports, had been terminated and had her license suspended pending review. The school board had implemented new mandatory reporter training and oversight protocols. The local VFW had quietly removed my father's photo from their wall. The community that had protected him had slowly distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with a convicted child abuser regardless of his service record. A few diehards had still claimed he'd been railroaded by an oversensitive system, but most people had quietly accepted that the evidence had been damning and the conviction appropriate. Dylan had been in therapy twice a week with Dr. Solomon, working through the trauma of the abuse and the complicated feelings about his grandfather. He'd had nightmares about basements for months. He'd flinched at raised voices. He'd been afraid of being left alone. But slowly, with consistent safety and therapy, he'd started healing. He'd gained back the weight he'd lost. He'd smiled more. He'd made friends at his new school where nobody knew about his grandfather. The resilience children showed when finally safe had been remarkable to witness. My daughter Megan, who I'd had limited contact with during the custody battle, had started spending more time with us once Lisa had understood the severity of what had happened. She'd been horrified that her father, my ex-wife's former father-in-law, had been abusing Dylan while everyone had trusted him. I'd been promoted to Sergeant First Class 6 months after the trial, recognition of my 12 years of service and successful deployment. The promotion board had been aware of the family situation, had reviewed it as part of my evaluation, and had determined that protecting my child from abuse demonstrated exactly the kind of character the Army valued. My command had been supportive throughout, granting the extended family leave I'd needed, accommodating therapy appointments and court dates, understanding that taking care of my family was part of my duty as a soldier and father. The same military culture that had celebrated my father's service had also supported holding him accountable when that service became an excuse for abuse. 2 years after my father's imprisonment, I'd received a letter from him. He'd been allowed limited correspondence, and he'd written asking for forgiveness, claiming he'd finally understood what he'd done wrong, that prison had given him time to reflect. The letter had been carefully worded, suggesting remorse without fully admitting the extent of the abuse. I'd read it once, then had filed it away without responding. Forgiveness wasn't something he could request and receive like a pardon. It was something Dylan would decide for himself if and when he was ready, probably years from now, probably with Dr. Solomon's help. My role wasn't to forgive my father for abusing my son. My role was to ensure Dylan was safe, healing, and knew that his father had protected him even when it meant destroying family relationships and challenging community reverence for a decorated veteran. Dylan was 9 years old now, doing well in school, playing soccer, making friends. He still saw Dr. Solomon monthly, still had occasional nightmares, still sometimes asked questions about why his grandfather had hurt him. I'd answered honestly, but age-appropriately, that sometimes people make bad choices, that abuse was never the victim's fault, that the grandfather's actions were his own responsibility. Dylan had asked if I'd ever locked kids in basements when I was in the Army. I'd told him no, that real discipline was about teaching and guiding, not terrorizing and hurting. He'd seemed satisfied with that answer. He'd asked if his grandfather was a bad person. I'd said people were complicated, that someone could do great things in one part of their life and terrible things in another, and that we had to judge actions rather than accepting someone's entire history as an excuse. The officer who'd responded to my initial call, Jeremy Paulson, had been quietly disciplined for his handling of the situation. An internal review had found that his deference to my father's status had violated proper procedure for responding to child abuse reports, that he should have ensured immediate medical examination and CPS notification regardless of the accused's community standing. He'd been required to undergo additional training and had been reassigned to administrative duties temporarily. The department had implemented new protocols specifically to prevent veteran status or community position from influencing abuse investigations. The systemic change, while small, had been meaningful. The next child in Dylan's situation might be protected immediately rather than having to overcome community bias first. I'd thought often about that moment when Officer Paulson had stepped back and asked if Command Sergeant Major Holt was really my dad, the hesitation in his voice suggesting my father's status mattered more than my son's injuries. That hesitation had nearly allowed the abuse to continue, had nearly resulted in Dylan being returned to his abuser because challenging a decorated veteran was uncomfortable. The entire system, from the police to the school to the community, had been designed to protect my father's reputation rather than protect children. It had taken medical evidence, legal intervention, media pressure, and a judge willing to ignore military service when evaluating child abuse to break through that protection. Justice had been possible, but it had required fighting every institution that should have automatically protected an abused child. My father would be eligible for parole in 6 years, having served his minimum sentence. I'd already prepared a victim impact statement opposing parole, detailing the ongoing effects of his abuse on Dylan, the betrayal of trust that had damaged our entire family. Dr. Solomon had said she'd testify at the parole hearing if needed, that Dylan's trauma response and ongoing therapy were directly connected to the systematic abuse. The parole board would hear from multiple sources that Raymond Holt represented an ongoing danger to children despite his age and service record. Whether they'd grant parole or require him to serve his full sentence would depend on factors I couldn't control, but I could ensure they had complete information about the harm he'd caused and the manipulation he'd employed. The house my father had owned, where Dylan had been locked in that basement, had been sold to pay legal fees and restitution. The new owners had renovated it, removed the padlock from the basement door, finished the space into a playroom. They'd had no idea of its history. I'd driven past it once, seen children's toys visible through the windows, and had felt this strange mix of relief and residual anger. Relief that the space was no longer associated with abuse. Anger that it had taken so long and so much effort to protect one child from one abuser, all because of military decorations and community respect. Sometimes people asked me if I regretted calling the police that day, if destroying my father's reputation and freedom had been worth it. The question always struck me as absurd. My son had been locked in a basement, bruised, traumatized, systematically abused. The only regret I had was trusting my father in the first place, believing that military service equaled good character, assuming that a decorated veteran couldn't also be a child abuser. The lesson I'd learned, the lesson Dylan would unfortunately carry forward, was that titles and medals and community respect meant nothing when evaluating someone's character. Actions revealed character. My father's actions had revealed a man willing to terrorize a child under the guise of discipline. Everything else was just decoration. The recording Dr. Keating had made of Dylan describing the abuse, the medical evidence Dr. Solomon had compiled of his trauma, the school records showing systematic failure to protect, all of it lived in a secure file with Judith Carpenter, preserved as evidence if ever needed again. Dylan didn't know the full extent of the documentation. Didn't need to know that his childhood trauma had been cataloged and preserved for legal purposes. But someday, if he wanted to understand exactly what had happened and how the system had both failed and eventually protected him, the evidence would be there. The truth, documented and undeniable, protected by people who'd cared more about a child's safety than a veteran's reputation. That protection, hard-won against community pressure and systemic bias, was the real victory. My father was in prison not because I'd destroyed him, but because the truth, properly documented and persistently presented, had destroyed the myth that decorated veterans were incapable of abuse. He'd lost everything that mattered to him: his freedom, his reputation, his family, not through my accusations, but through his own actions finally facing consequences. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.